The music hall stood proudly in the center of town, its tall windows glowing warmly against the early evening sky. Inside, the air felt thick with anticipation. Parents adjusted their seats, teachers flipped through printed programs, and students waited backstage with pounding hearts. It was the annual Youth Piano Showcase, an event many families had prepared for all year. For some, it was simply a chance to perform. For others, it felt like a moment that could change everything. Near the front row sat a well-known American music teacher. Many people in the room recognized the teacher immediately. Years of experience, awards, and successful students had built a strong reputation. The teacher was known for discipline, high standards, and sharp opinions. Some admired that confidence. Others found it intimidating. Tonight, the teacher had been invited as a special judge. The program moved smoothly at first. One student after another walked onto the stage, bowed politely, and played carefully practiced pieces. Some performed with strong technique. Others made small mistakes but finished bravely. The audience clapped kindly each time. The teacher watched closely, making small notes on the paper resting on their lap. Backstage, behind the heavy velvet curtains, stood a young piano player waiting for their turn. The hall sounded distant from where the child stood, but every burst of applause echoed clearly. The young performer wore simple clothes, clean but not fancy. The shoes were slightly worn at the edges. The hands resting at their sides looked small against the wide black stage curtain. This performance meant more than just applause. It was not about trophies or praise. It was about being seen. Earlier that afternoon, when the list of performers had been reviewed, the teacher had paused briefly at the young player's name. There had been no well-known music academy listed beside it. No mention of private lessons with famous instructors. No competition history. Just a local registration and a short description of the chosen piece. The teacher had lifted an eyebrow slightly. When the young performer arrived for check-in, the teacher noticed the quiet posture, the simple appearance, the nervous way the child held the sheet music. In that short glance, a quiet judgment formed. The teacher assumed this would be another average performance, perhaps even a weak one. Experience had created quick conclusions. Backstage, the young piano player pressed their palms together to stop them from shaking. The old upright piano at home had uneven keys. Some notes stuck slightly when pressed too hard. The bench wobbled unless a folded piece of cardboard was placed under one leg. But that piano had become a best friend over the past 2 years. Every evening after school, while other children played outside, this child practiced. Sometimes the neighbors complained about repeated scales. Sometimes the power went out, and practice continued in dim light near the window. There had been no professional instructor sitting beside them. Instead, there were online tutorial videos, borrowed music books, and hours of patient listening. The stage manager whispered softly, "You're next." The young piano player nodded, swallowing the lump in their throat. The curtain felt taller than a mountain. The sound of the previous performer's final notes still lingered in the air as polite applause filled the hall. Out in the audience, the teacher leaned back in the chair, arms loosely crossed. There was a quiet confidence in that posture. Years of experience had made it easy to predict which students would impress and which would struggle. The announcer's voice rang gently through the hall, introducing the next performer. A small figure stepped onto the stage. For a moment, the bright lights felt blinding. The young piano player could not clearly see the audience, only shadows and shapes beyond the glow. But one thing was clear. The grand piano at center stage looked nothing like the one at home. It was polished to a mirror shine, its surface reflecting the lights above. The keys were perfectly even, untouched by scratches. The child walked carefully toward the bench, each step measured. The hall was quiet now. A few whispers moved through the seats. Some people noticed the simplicity of the performer's appearance. A few exchanged doubtful glances without meaning to. The teacher observed closely. The child adjusted the bench slightly, not too high, not too low. That small movement caught the teacher's attention. It was done with quiet confidence, not confusion. Still, doubt remained. The young piano player placed both hands gently on the keys, but did not begin right away. Instead, there was a brief pause. A deep breath. Eyes lowered. Backstage, the stage manager peeked through the curtain, hoping everything would go smoothly. In the audience, a mother squeezed her hands together, silently praying. A father leaned forward slightly, trying to read the child's expression from afar. The teacher tapped a pen lightly against the program. The silence stretched for just a second longer than comfortable. Then the first note sounded. It was soft. So soft that a few people in the back straightened in their seats, unsure if the performance had truly begun. The note hung in the air like a fragile thread. Another note followed. Then another. The opening felt delicate, almost cautious. The teacher's pen hovered over the paper, ready to write. But something about the timing was precise. The pauses were not accidental. They felt intentional. The young piano player's fingers began to move more steadily. The melody slowly unfolded, like someone telling a story without rushing the words. It was not loud. It was not flashy. It was careful and thoughtful. The teacher leaned forward slightly, noticing the control in the child's wrists. The posture was natural. The shoulders were relaxed. These were not the habits of someone careless. Still, the teacher kept expectations low. The audience remained quiet, listening politely. The child's heart pounded loudly inside their chest, but the rhythm of the music helped steady it. Each familiar sequence of notes felt like stepping stones across a river. The fear began to soften. The music grew a little stronger. The left hand joined more confidently, supporting the melody with deeper tones. The sound filled more of the hall now, reaching farther into the corners of the room. The teacher's pen lowered slowly. There was something different here. The performance had only just begun, yet there was a sense of intention behind every movement. The child was not simply pressing keys. There was emotion in the touch, a quiet feeling that could not be taught easily. A small mistake almost happened when one finger brushed the wrong key, but it was corrected so smoothly that most of the audience did not notice. The recovery showed awareness beyond years. The teacher uncrossed their arms. The piece continued to build gently. It was still early in the performance, but already the atmosphere in the hall had shifted slightly. The whispers had stopped completely. Even the occasional cough had faded. The young piano player forgot about the bright lights. Forgot about the judge in the front row. Forgot about the worn shoes and simple clothes. In that moment, there was only the piano and the story hidden inside the music. The teacher watched more carefully now, no longer with quick judgment, but with curiosity. The first section of the piece came to a soft pause. The final note of that opening phrase lingered in the air before fading completely. No one clapped yet. It was clear the performance was far from over. But something had already changed. The teacher slowly lowered the pen onto the program without writing a single word. For the first time that evening, expectations were no longer certain. And as the young piano player prepared to move into the next part of the piece, the hall seemed to lean in just a little closer. The second part of the piece began more boldly than the first. The soft introduction had settled the room, but now the music started to rise. The young piano player pressed the keys with more strength, and the sound traveled clearly to the very back of the hall. It no longer felt fragile. It felt certain. In the front row, the teacher adjusted their posture again. The earlier doubt was not completely gone, but it was no longer as strong. There was something steady in the child's timing. The rhythm did not rush. It did not drag. It moved forward with quiet confidence. The young performer's fingers moved faster now, crossing over each other with surprising smoothness. The left hand carried a deeper pattern, while the right hand danced lightly above it. It was not perfect, but it was alive. That was the difference. Backstage, the stage manager stopped pacing and stood still, listening. A few other students waiting for their turns peeked through the curtain. Some had expected an average performance. Instead, they found themselves watching closely. The music began to tell a clearer story. It felt like a journey, starting small, then growing braver step by step. The child's shoulders relaxed more with each measure. The fear that had been so visible before was slowly being replaced by focus. In the audience, a few people exchanged glances, but this time the looks were different. They were not doubtful anymore. They were surprised. The teacher's eyes narrowed slightly, not in criticism but in concentration. Years of experience made it easy to spot empty performances, the kind where students only repeat memorized movements without emotion. This was not one of those performances. The young piano player had stopped looking at the audience completely. The bright lights no longer mattered. Even the judge in the front row faded from thought. The only thing that existed now was the sound and the next note waiting to be played. A challenging section approached, one that had caused many mistakes during practice at home. The old piano there had uneven keys, and some fast passages never sounded quite right. Here, on this grand instrument, the keys responded smoothly. The child felt the difference instantly. Instead of fear, a small spark of excitement appeared. The fingers moved into the difficult part. The notes flowed quickly, like water running over smooth stones. There was a tiny slip, barely noticeable, but the recovery came so naturally that it blended into the music. Most of the audience did not hear it at all. The teacher did. And instead of marking it down, the teacher noticed something else. The recovery showed awareness. It showed listening. The child was not just playing from memory. The child was truly hearing the music and adjusting in real time. That realization made the teacher sit even straighter. The sound in the hall grew warmer as the piece continued. The deeper notes vibrated gently through the wooden floor. The higher notes shimmered like light reflecting on glass. The balance between both hands was thoughtful. Nothing overpowered the other. A woman in the third row felt her eyes grow slightly wet.
She did not know why.
Maybe it was the honesty in the playing. Maybe it was the sight of someone so young carrying so much emotion through music. The young performer remembered the late nights of practice. The times when frustration almost caused tears. The moments when it felt impossible to get a section right. All those hours were now coming together on this stage. The teacher, who had looked down upon the child earlier, now felt a small discomfort inside. Not because the performance was bad, but because the earlier judgment had been too quick. Experience was valuable, but assumptions could still be wrong. The music shifted again, moving into a quieter middle section. This part felt softer but deeper. The tempo slowed slightly, giving space for emotion. Each note felt carefully placed, like stepping gently across fragile ground. The hall was completely silent now. No coughing. No whispering. Even the restless children in the back rows were still. The young piano player closed their eyes for a brief moment. Not for drama. Not for attention. It simply felt natural. The music was no longer something to control. It was something to feel. The teacher noticed the closed eyes and expected a mistake to follow. Often, young performers lost focus when they did that. But the notes continued smoothly. The touch remained balanced. The timing stayed steady. Something inside the teacher began to shift. It was a small change at first. A quiet thought. Maybe I was wrong. The performance reached a gentle pause. The child lifted both hands slightly above the keys, letting the last soft note fade fully before continuing. That pause felt intentional and mature. It showed patience, something not easily taught. A man sitting near the back leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fully drawn into the sound. The music did not feel like a school performance anymore. It felt like a story unfolding in real time. Backstage, one of the other young performers whispered, "Wow," under their breath. The stage lights reflected softly on the polished piano surface. The young player's reflection moved along with each motion of the hands. There was no sign of panic anymore. Only focus. The teacher glanced down at the blank judging paper. Not a single comment had been written yet. That had never happened before. Usually, notes filled the page quickly, corrections, observations, suggestions. Now, the teacher simply listened. The music began building again, slowly climbing toward something bigger. The rhythm grew stronger. The notes became more powerful, but not aggressive. The control remained. The young piano player felt a wave of energy rise from deep inside. It was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about expressing everything that had been practiced in quiet rooms with no audience. Each chord landed firmly, yet not harshly. The fingers pressed with confidence, then lifted with care. The body moved slightly with the rhythm. Not exaggerated, just natural. The teacher felt a strange mix of pride and humility. Pride in witnessing genuine talent. Humility in realizing how easily it had been dismissed before it even began. The audience could sense the performance moving toward something important. The air felt heavier, but not tense, more like anticipation before a meaningful moment. The child's breathing stayed steady. The hands did not shake anymore. The earlier nerves had transformed into strength. A difficult sequence approached once again, faster this time, louder, more demanding. The young performer leaned slightly forward and began. The notes rushed forward like a sudden wind, yet remained controlled. Fingers moved with surprising speed. The sound filled the hall completely now, reaching every corner. The teacher's eyes widened slightly. This was no ordinary student performance. When the sequence ended, it flowed directly into a powerful chord that echoed deeply. The vibration lingered for a second longer than expected. No one moved. The young piano player's face showed deep concentration, but also something else. Quiet joy. Not a smile, but a feeling of belonging at the instrument. The teacher slowly placed both hands together, resting them thoughtfully. This was no longer about doubt. It was about recognition. The second part of the piece was nearing its end, but the energy in the room had completely transformed from the beginning. What started with quiet uncertainty had grown into full attention. As the final notes of this section approached, the child softened the touch once more, bringing the music back to a gentle tone. It felt like a deep breath after something intense. The last note of part 2 faded slowly into silence. Again, no one clapped yet. The piece was clearly not finished. But this time, the silence felt different. It was no longer polite waiting.
It was respect.
And in that silence, the teacher understood something important. Talent does not always arrive wrapped in confidence or recognition. Sometimes it walks quietly onto a stage, underestimated, and simply begins to play. The silence after the second section did not feel empty. It felt full of expectation, full of emotion, full of something unspoken moving quietly through the room. The young piano player kept both hands resting lightly above the keys, waiting for just the right moment to continue. In the front row, the teacher no longer looked relaxed. The earlier confidence had been replaced with careful attention. The judging paper still remained untouched. That had never happened before. Usually by this point, there would be notes written in neat lines, comments about technique, posture, expression. But now there was only a blank page, and a quiet realization growing stronger with each passing second. The child inhaled slowly and began the third part of the piece. This time, the sound did not start softly. It entered clearly and firmly, like someone speaking with calm certainty. The melody rose higher than before, stretching upward in a way that felt brave. There was no hesitation now. The nervous child who had walked onto the stage seemed far away. The fingers moved with more freedom. Not rushed, not forced, just natural. The music felt alive, as if it had been waiting for this moment to unfold fully. The grand piano responded beautifully to every touch, producing rich tones that seemed to wrap around the audience. A man sitting near the aisle leaned back slowly, surprised by how deeply he was being drawn in. He had come only to support a neighbor's child. He did not expect to feel moved. Yet here he was listening as if the music were speaking directly to him. The young performer's mind was no longer crowded with fear. Instead, memories surfaced. Quiet evenings at home, practicing again and again. The old upright piano with its uneven keys. The sound of rain outside the small window. The way frustration sometimes felt too heavy to carry. All of that was inside the music now. The third section demanded more control. There were sudden changes in volume, quick transitions from soft to strong. The child handled them carefully. When the notes needed to whisper, they whispered. When they needed to rise, they rose without losing shape. The teacher noticed the small details, the careful lift of the wrist at the end of a phrase, the slight pause before a powerful chord, the balanced pressure between both hands. These were not accidental. These were signs of someone who truly understood the piece. A quiet thought passed through the teacher's mind. How did this child learn this alone? Backstage, a few of the other performers stood frozen near the curtain. No one whispered now. Even the usual backstage noise, shuffling papers, nervous breathing, had disappeared. Everyone was listening. The music began to grow more emotional. It was not loud for the sake of being loud. It carried weight. Each chord seemed to hold a feeling that words could not describe. The child leaned slightly forward, completely connected to the instrument. In the middle rows, a woman pressed a hand gently against her chest. She could not explain it, but the music reminded her of something from her own childhood, a dream once held tightly, then slowly set aside. The sound stirred something deep and personal. The teacher shifted again in the seat. Earlier in the evening, there had been confidence in judging quickly. Now there was quiet humility. It was becoming clear that assumptions had nearly covered something special. The third part reached a fast-moving section that required both speed and clarity. The fingers flew across the keys, but the sound remained clean. Notes did not blur together. Each one had space, even at high speed. A small bead of sweat formed near the child's temple, but it did not distract. The breathing remained steady. The body moved gently with the rhythm, not dramatically, just enough to show connection. The hall felt smaller now, as if everyone had drawn closer together through shared attention. No one checked their phone. No one glanced at the exit. All eyes were fixed on the stage. The teacher remembered the first glance at the simple clothes, the worn shoes. That image felt distant now. What mattered was the sound filling the room. The piece shifted again into a softer bridge. The tempo slowed, and the melody became tender. It felt like a quiet conversation after something intense. The child's touch softened beautifully, proving that control was not only about power, but also about restraint. The teacher finally picked up the pen, not to criticize, but to write a single word: depth. The young piano player felt a calm confidence growing stronger. There was no longer a need to prove anything. The music itself was enough. Each note felt honest. A sudden dynamic change arrived. A bold, dramatic chord followed by a sweeping run down the keyboard. The child executed it with precision. The sound echoed strongly against the hall walls, creating a powerful vibration that seemed to linger in the air. A few people in the audience exchanged wide-eyed glances. This was no longer surprising. It was impressive. The teacher felt a small smile form, though it was barely visible. Not a proud smile, but one of recognition. True talent had a way of revealing itself clearly. The third part was building toward something larger. The rhythm grew steady and strong, like footsteps moving forward without fear. The young performer's posture remained upright and relaxed. There was strength in the arms, but no tension. The old doubts were completely gone now. The audience could sense the approach of a peak. The energy in the hall felt charged but controlled. It was like standing before a wave, knowing it would rise high before settling again. The child's hands moved into the most demanding section yet. Fast notes climbed upward, then descended rapidly. The timing remained exact. Not once did the rhythm lose shape. The teacher felt something shift deeply inside, not just admiration, but reflection. How many times had young students been underestimated because of first impressions? How often had potential been measured by appearance instead of ability? The final build of the third section arrived with full force. The music swelled, filling every corner of the room. The young piano player pressed the keys with powerful emotion, yet still maintained control. It was strong but never harsh. And then, suddenly, everything softened. The hands slowed. The melody returned to something gentle and thoughtful. It felt like the closing of a chapter. Not the end of the story, but a deep breath before what would come next. The last note of part 3 rang out clearly and then faded. This time, the silence felt even heavier than before. The audience did not move. It was as if no one wanted to break the moment. The teacher lowered the pen slowly, staring at the stage with new understanding. The earlier judgment felt distant and unimportant now. What mattered was the truth unfolding in front of everyone. The young piano player kept both hands resting lightly on the keys, eyes still lowered. The heart was no longer racing with fear. It was steady, grounded, strong. 3 parts had passed, and with each one, something deeper had been revealed. Not just skill, but character. Not just practice, but persistence. The hall waited quietly for the next note, knowing that something unforgettable was still ahead. The silence after the 3rd part felt deeper than any silence before it. It was no longer just a pause between sections of music. It felt like the entire hall was holding its breath together. The young piano player slowly lifted both hands from the keys and let them rest gently on their lap for just a second. The shoulders rose and fell with one steady breath. The bright stage lights were still warm against the face, but they no longer felt overwhelming. The fear from earlier had completely faded. In its place was something calmer, something stronger. In the front row, the teacher sat very still. The earlier blank page now had a few words written on it, not corrections, not criticism, but honest observations. The teacher's expression had softened. The crossed arms were gone. Both hands now rested loosely on the knees, eyes focused fully on the stage. The 4th part began, without warning. A single strong chord broke the silence. It was bold and confident, almost surprising after the gentle ending of the previous section. A few people in the audience straightened in their seats. The sound filled the hall quickly, reaching the back rows with ease. The young performer leaned slightly forward again, fingers pressing firmly against the keys. The music had entered a powerful stage now. It carried energy that felt almost fearless. The rhythm grew steady and determined, like footsteps walking forward without hesitation. Each chord landed clearly. Each note had purpose. There was no sign of nervousness anymore. The teacher felt a quiet realization forming fully now. This was not a lucky performance. This was not accidental talent. This was the result of hard work and deep connection. The young piano player's hands moved faster again, but with more strength than before. The sound was larger, fuller. It echoed off the walls and ceiling, creating a rich vibration that seemed to wrap around every listener. In the middle rows, someone whispered softly, "Wow," without meaning to. The words slipped out before it could be stopped. The music shifted into a dramatic sequence, strong chords in the left hand while the right hand carried a rising melody that felt almost triumphant. It was as if the piece itself was telling a story of struggle and growth. The child's face showed intense focus. The eyebrows were slightly drawn together, not in fear, but in concentration. The body moved naturally with the rhythm, showing complete involvement in every sound. Backstage, the other young performers stood frozen. One of them slowly lowered the sheet music they had been holding, completely distracted from their own upcoming turn. Even the stage manager, who had seen countless performances, felt a small chill run down their arms. The 4th part continued to build. The notes climbed higher and higher, each phrase pushing forward with energy. It felt like the music was reaching for something just out of reach, but worth chasing. The teacher remembered the first glance at the registration form, the quick judgment made without real thought. That memory now felt heavy. Not painful, but humbling. Another strong chord rang out, followed by a fast run down the keyboard. The young performer executed it cleanly, hands moving with surprising confidence. The audience remained silent, but the silence was no longer polite. It was filled with admiration. A woman near the aisle wiped her eyes gently. The music was not just impressive. It felt personal. It felt honest. The young piano player no longer saw the audience at all. The world had narrowed down to 88 keys, and the story flowing through them. Each note felt like a step forward, like proof that all those quiet hours of practice had mattered. The music reached its most demanding section yet. Rapid notes in both hands, crossing and weaving together. The fingers moved with strength and clarity. There was no hesitation, no doubt. The teacher leaned slightly forward, completely drawn in now. Years of experience made it easy to spot technical skill, but what stood out more was the emotion. It was real.
It was not forced.
The sound in the hall felt alive. It rose and fell like waves, powerful and then controlled again. The young performer handled every change with surprising maturity. A brief pause arrived, not long, but enough to create tension. The hands hovered above the keys for half a heartbeat. Then came the turning point. The child pressed into a bold series of chords that echoed strongly through the hall. The sound was full and confident, almost defiant. It felt like a statement. In that moment, something shifted completely inside the teacher. The earlier sense of authority faded. What remained was simple respect. The music did not just sound good. It meant something. The audience could feel it too. The air seemed charged, like before a thunderstorm. But instead of fear, there was excitement building quietly. The young performer moved into a rising scale that climbed higher and higher, fingers flying across the keys. The sound shimmered brightly. When it reached the top, it exploded into a powerful chord that filled the entire space. For a split second, there was complete silence. And then it happened. Before the piece had even fully ended, a wave of energy moved through the crowd. A few people gasped softly. Someone near the back began clapping without thinking, quickly stopping when they realized the music was still continuing. The child transitioned into the final stretch of the fourth part, strong, confident, full of life. The earlier quiet beginning of the performance felt like a distant memory now. The teacher felt something unfamiliar, pride mixed with humility. Pride in witnessing this moment. Humility in knowing it had almost been overlooked. The music swelled once more, louder than before, but never losing control. The young piano player's arms moved with power, yet the fingers remained precise. And then, with one final strong chord, the fourth part came to a dramatic close. This time, the silence lasted only a heartbeat. The hall erupted. Applause burst out from every direction, loud and genuine. People rose from their seats almost without thinking. The sound of clapping filled the space like a storm of approval. The young piano player froze for just a second, surprised. The piece was not fully finished yet, but the audience could not hold back their reaction to that powerful moment. The teacher stood slowly, joining the applause. There was no hesitation anymore. No doubt. Only respect. On stage, the child blinked in surprise, taking in the standing ovation. The bright lights still hid most faces, but the sound of clapping was clear and strong. It felt overwhelming in a different way now, not frightening, but uplifting. The young performer gave a small nod of acknowledgement, then gently placed both hands back on the keys. The applause slowly softened, and the hall grew quiet again. There was still more music to come, but everything had already changed. The teacher sat back down, heart beating differently than before. This performance was no longer just another student showcase. It had become a lesson, one that would not be forgotten. As the young piano player prepared to begin the final part of the piece, the atmosphere in the hall was no longer filled with expectation. It was filled with belief. The applause slowly faded, but the energy in the hall did not disappear. It stayed in the air, warm and alive. The young piano player kept both hands resting gently on the keys, waiting for the room to settle again. The earlier nervous child was gone. In that place now sat someone steady and confident. The final part of the piece was about to begin. The teacher, now fully attentive, leaned slightly forward. There was no judgment left in those eyes. Only curiosity and respect. The blank spaces on the judging sheet no longer mattered. What mattered was the music still waiting to be heard. The child inhaled slowly and began the last section. This time, the sound returned softly, almost like the opening of the performance. But it was different now. It carried depth that had grown through everything that came before. The first notes felt gentle, reflective, almost thoughtful. It was as if the music was looking back on its own journey. The audience listened closely. No one shifted in their seat. Even the smallest sounds, a cough, a whisper, seemed to disappear. The hall felt united in attention. The young piano player allowed each note to breathe. The fingers pressed the keys with care, not rushing forward. The tempo was calm, but steady. It felt like the quiet after a storm, peaceful, but still powerful. In the front row, the teacher felt something personal rising inside. It was not just admiration for talent. It was a reminder that passion does not need permission to exist. It simply grows wherever it is given space. The final section slowly began to build again. The melody carried hope this time, lighter but still strong. The left hand supported with warm, steady chords while the right hand told the main story. The child's posture remained relaxed. There was no sign of fear anymore. The hands moved naturally, as if the piano and performer had become one. Somewhere in the middle rows, a father sat with his hands folded tightly. He had worked long hours to make sure his child could practice at home. He had worried that the old piano would not be enough. Now, watching this moment unfold, his eyes filled quietly with pride. The teacher noticed the emotion in the room. It was not just about impressive technique. It was about connection. Every person in that hall felt part of something meaningful. The music grew brighter. The melody rose upward again, but this time it felt joyful rather than dramatic. It felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. The sound sparkled across the room. The young piano player smiled slightly, not at the audience, but at the keys. It was a small, honest smile, one that came from inside. The final challenging section approached. It was fast, detailed, and required full focus. The child's fingers moved with speed and precision. Every note landed clearly. There was no struggle now, only confidence. The teacher felt a deep sense of humility. Earlier in the evening, assumptions had been made too quickly. Now those assumptions felt small and unimportant. The music reached its final build. The sound grew fuller, stronger, filling every corner of the hall. The child pressed into each chord with strength, but never harshness. The timing remained steady. The control remained perfect. The audience could feel the end approaching. Hearts beat a little faster. Breathing slowed. The young piano player leaned slightly forward, eyes still focused downward. The final run of notes began, fast and flowing like a river moving toward its destination. The fingers flew across the keyboard one last time. And then came the final chord. It rang out clear and powerful. The sound echoed against the walls, lingered in the air, and slowly faded into complete silence. For one long second, no one moved. The quiet felt sacred. Then the hall erupted. Applause exploded from every direction. Louder than before. Stronger than before. People rose from their seats immediately, clapping with genuine excitement. Some cheered. Some wiped tears from their faces. The young piano player sat frozen for a brief moment, overwhelmed. The sound of the applause felt unreal. It rolled through the hall like thunder. The teacher stood up slowly, clapping with full respect. There was no pride in being right or wrong, only appreciation for what had just happened. The child finally stood from the bench and turned toward the audience. The bright lights still hid many faces, but the energy was clear. It felt like warmth pouring forward from every seat. The young performer gave a small bow, simple, humble, sincere. The applause grew even louder. Backstage, the other students began clapping too. The stage manager smiled widely, shaking their head in disbelief. The teacher felt something shift deep inside. It was not just admiration for talent. It was a lesson learned in a very real way. As the applause continued, the announcer walked onto the stage, smiling broadly. After a few more seconds, the clapping slowly softened enough for words to be heard. The young piano player stepped slightly aside, still holding onto the feeling of the final chord echoing in memory. When the announcer asked about the performer's training, there was a brief, honest explanation. No famous academy. No expensive private lessons. Mostly self-taught. Practice at home. Online videos. Determination. A wave of murmurs moved through the audience. Not disbelief, but amazement. The teacher lowered their gaze for a moment, thinking deeply. Talent had been there all along. It simply needed a chance to be heard. The applause started again, softer this time, but filled with admiration. It was not just for the music. It was for the journey behind it. The young piano player walked off the stage slowly, heart still racing, but in a different way now. Not from fear. From fulfillment. As the curtain closed gently, the hall continued buzzing with conversation. People spoke about what they had just witnessed. Some called it inspiring. Others called it unforgettable. In the front row, the teacher remained standing for a moment longer, staring at the stage where the child had sat only seconds before. It had been more than a performance. It had been a reminder. And the sound of that final chord seemed to echo long after the applause had faded. The applause did not fade quickly that night. Even after the curtain closed and the next performer began preparing backstage, the sound of clapping still echoed in people's conversations. The energy inside the hall had shifted completely. What started as a simple youth showcase had turned into something unforgettable. Backstage, the young piano player stood quietly near the wall, hands still slightly trembling, not from fear anymore, but from the rush of what had just happened. The heart was beating fast, but there was a calm feeling underneath it. A deep sense of relief. Months of practice, doubt, and quiet determination had led to this moment. Other students gathered around, offering small smiles and shy congratulations. Some looked inspired. Others looked thoughtful, as if they had just learned something important. The stage manager gently placed a hand on the young performer's shoulder and said softly, "That was beautiful." Across the hallway, the teacher stood alone for a moment. The judging paper was still in hand. The earlier blank space had been filled with only a few words: depth, control, honesty, maturity. There were no harsh corrections written, no sharp remarks. Instead, there was something much more valuable: understanding. The teacher took a slow breath and walked toward the backstage area. The hallway felt different now. The usual noise of busy events, footsteps, whispered instructions, nervous chatter, seemed softer. The teacher spotted the young piano player standing near a table with paper cups of water. For a brief second, there was hesitation. Pride can be heavy, especially when it needs to be set aside. But tonight, something more important than pride was at stake. The teacher approached. The young performer noticed and straightened slightly, unsure what would be said. The memory of that earlier look, the one filled with doubt, was still fresh. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the teacher said quietly, "You played with real feeling tonight." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The young piano player blinked in surprise. "Thank you," came the soft reply. There was no long speech. No dramatic apology. Just honesty. "I was wrong to judge too quickly," the teacher continued, voice calm. "What you showed on that stage, that cannot be taught easily." The child lowered their eyes for a second, unsure how to respond. There was no anger inside, only quiet understanding. "I just practiced a lot," came the simple answer. The teacher nodded slowly. "It shows." In that short conversation, something shifted between them. Not authority and student. Not judge and performer. Just two people connected by music. Meanwhile, out in the hall, audience members continued talking about the performance. Some were still seated, replaying the final chord in their minds. Others gathered near the exit, speaking with excitement about what they had witnessed. A local music director, who had been sitting in the back rows, approached the event organizer. "Who is that child?" he asked quietly. "I would like to know more." The organizer smiled, already expecting that question. "Self-taught mostly," she explained. "Hard worker." Backstage, the young piano player finally allowed a full smile to appear. The weight that had been carried for so long felt lighter now. It was never about proving someone wrong. It was about proving something to oneself. The teacher looked thoughtful. "Do you have a private instructor?" came the next question. The child shook their head gently. "No. I learned from videos and books." There was no shame in the answer, only truth. The teacher paused, then spoke carefully. "If you would like guidance, I would be honored to help." The offer was not made out of pity. It was made out of respect. The young piano player's eyes widened slightly. It felt unexpected, almost unreal. But the teacher's tone was sincere. "Thank you," the child replied softly. "That means a lot." Across the room, the father, who had worked long hours to keep that old piano at home, stood quietly, watching the conversation from a distance. He did not hear every word, but he could see the respect in the teacher's posture. And that was enough. The evening slowly came to an end. The final performers finished their pieces. Awards were announced. Applause filled the hall again and again. But even as other names were called, the earlier performance remained the one most people talked about. When it was time to leave, the young piano player stepped outside into the cool night air. The sky was clear, dotted with quiet stars. The noise of the city felt distant. The father placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder. "You did well," he said simply. There was no need for long speeches. The pride in his eyes said everything. On the drive home, the young performer looked out the window, replaying every moment in the mind. The first nervous step onto the stage, the powerful chords in the fourth part, the standing ovation, the teacher's words backstage. It felt like the beginning of something new. At home, the old upright piano waited in its usual corner. The keys were still uneven. The bench still wobbled slightly. But that night, it looked different. It looked like possibility. The child walked over and pressed one soft note, letting it ring gently in the quiet house. It did not sound as rich as the grand piano from the hall, but it sounded familiar, honest. The teacher, meanwhile, sat alone at a desk later that evening, thinking deeply. Years of experience had built confidence, but that night had reminded something important. Talent can grow anywhere. It does not always come wrapped in expensive lessons or polished appearances. The next morning, the teacher made a phone call to the event organizer, asking for the family's contact information. Not for publicity, not for recognition, but for opportunity. In the days that followed, small changes began to happen. The young piano player received an invitation to perform at another local event. Then another. Word had spread quietly but steadily. People wanted to hear that honest sound again. With guidance from the teacher, new techniques were introduced. Not to change the child's style, but to strengthen it. Practice continued every evening, just as before, but now with clearer direction. There were still challenges, still difficult pieces, still moments of frustration. But something inside had grown stronger, belief. The teacher also changed in small but meaningful ways. At the next showcase event, every student was watched with fresh eyes. No quick assumptions. No silent judgments based on background or appearance. The lesson had been learned. Months later, during another performance, the teacher sat in the audience once again. This time, there was no doubt at the beginning. Only anticipation. The young piano player walked onto the stage with quiet confidence, wearing the same simple smile. The journey was far from over. There would be bigger stages one day, harder pieces, greater challenges. But the most important victory had already happened. It happened the night the hall erupted in excitement. It happened the moment respect replaced doubt. And long after the applause faded, both the teacher and the young piano player carried that lesson forward. Not just in music, but in life. Because sometimes the greatest performance is not just about the notes played on a piano. It is about the assumptions left behind.